I get started, if you did not grab one of the outlines, if you'll just raise your hand, someone from the back will come forward and hand you one of the outlines. If you'd like one, just raise your hand up. It'd be good to have, just simply because with the time limits, we may not be able to cover all of it, and so you can go home and kind of look at the rest of it if we're not able to cover all the aspects. And there may be a moment tonight, and depending on how good at time management I am, we'll figure that out here in a little bit, but that I may jump, because at the very end of this study is kind of the only time within the series that I address in very specific ways single people, and so I may want to jump to that. So if you see a moment where I'm just clicking through the slides and kind of jump to the end, it's because I looked at the clock and I want to get to it. And so just be prepared for that moment when it happens tonight, because I wanted to talk about every aspect of family life, and in many senses single life is the predecessor to family life, and I want to address some of those things, Lord willing, before we're done this evening. Does that cover everybody? Anybody else? And I think those will be available as you come in every night. They'll be available there in the back. You can grab them as you come in. I think they're on the website as well, if you want to download them ahead of time. And if you feel like you need to pay somebody for that, just stick it in my pocket when you walk out the door. That's a joke, by the way. All right, let's get started. We've been talking about this more excellent way. In 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 31, Paul declares that there's a better way, that God has the best gifts in mind for His children, and He desires that we follow the best paths possible. And he says there's a more excellent way in service to God. And then he begins this discourse in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, where he begins to describe what love really is. Yesterday, we talked about the fact that single word definition of God is love. And if God is love, if He's the epitome of it, if you were trying to look up a definition and wanted to put a picture beside the word love in the dictionary, a representation of God would need to go there, because He's the one that epitomizes what love is. If that statement is correct, as we studied yesterday, then it's God who has the right to tell us what love really means. You know, sometimes I think we've got a funny kind of idea of what love really means. We think of love as that kind of fluttery little feeling that you get when you first meet the person you think you might be interested in, or that infatuation kind of mode. And that's not really love. It's part of the process at times, but it's not love as God would describe it. In 1 Corinthians chapter 13, we have for us outlined in very specific form God's definition of love. We're jumping into the chapter tonight, and we're in verse 5 actually this evening. Last night we began the process of talking about some things that we simply have defined as love-depleting challenges. The things that the writer Paul here says are the absolute opposite of what love is, and it would behoove us to understand these, we said last night, to purge them out in order to get the right kind of love in its place in our lives. And so in verse 5 of 1 Corinthians chapter 13, he simply said that love does not behave rudely, does not seek its own, is not provoked, it thinks no evil. I've shrunk that down to two basic concepts for us to consider tonight, and that is that love is not selfish, and that love does not get angry. That anger and selfishness are contrary to what God would desire for us to have in the idea of love. And let's start with the concept of selfishness before we talk a little bit about anger tonight. We referenced anger yesterday a little. But selfishness, I am convinced, is at the core of many family problems. It causes all the kinds of things that you see on the screen before you. Adultery, fornication, divorce, financial difficulties, things that have plagued many a relationship, things that have challenged many families in very specific ways, I'm convinced are all a result of selfishness on somebody's part. Now, maybe both people are selfish individuals. Maybe both of them are responsible. Heavy debt sometimes comes into relationships because neither one of the spouses has any kind of measure of restraint, and they both go out and create difficulties and challenges because they're thinking selfishly. It is about them, and whatever I want I get, and so the debt rises. Sometimes it may be a single spouse in that challenge. Adultery. Friends, let me suggest to you tonight that adultery, and we think of it as this challenging, sinful thing, and certainly it is, but let me suggest to you that it has a core problem. Adultery, I don't think anybody just wakes up one day and says, I'm going to cheat on my spouse. I don't know that anybody just kind of arrives one morning and just decides that's what I'm going to do. It is a result of a continuing thought process that says whatever I want, I get. It's a selfish act. It's the idea of that if I want something, I deserve to have it. I deserve happiness. I deserve joy. And we convince ourselves that earthly pleasures are the source of joy and happiness. And we make some pretty poor decisions. All of these challenges, the divorce rate, and all the things that we see plague, not just society, but even the Lord's body, are many a result of selfishness among people. Anger also presents itself in many ways, robbing folks of the love that their homes deserve. And so let's talk about these things, even the grudges often that come and the resentment that is a result of both of these. And in fact, they're a stark contrast, if you go to Luke chapter 9 and verse 23, to what Jesus would desire. In Luke chapter 9 and verse 23, Jesus' words, as he says to all of them, if anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. Friends, God has called all of us through His Son to do something, and it is not act selfishly. What He has called us to do is to deny self. And I want you to notice how important it is. It's so important that Jesus says it is a daily activity. Sometimes we are selfless on occasion. We take a moment to be selfless. We take a moment to where we're generous, we're giving, we do something on behalf of another. We take a moment in life and we do a good deed. And we say to ourselves, well, I'm not selfish because 6 weeks ago I helped somebody. That's not necessarily true. Jesus tells us in this text that self-denial is a daily operation, that I wake up every day, not just on occasion, not just when it's convenient, not when it's comfortable, that every day of the week I wake up and I say to myself, today is a day not to seek my own, but today is a day to self-deny. To allow Jesus to rule in my life. The selfishness and anger that we're speaking of tonight is exactly opposite of what Jesus challenges us to do in Luke chapter 9. And let me suggest to you that's challenged family life. You see, selfishness depletes love even among children. And the reason for that is I think we've caused it. You know, I as a parent sometimes, I become frustrated when folks throw up their hands and they say something like this, kids these days. Well, let me tell you folks, kids these days are a result of parents these days, right? We get what it is that we have guided and directed. Yes, there are occasional exceptions to that, and sometimes people are guided and led in the right directions, and they choose the wrong paths. I recognize that to be a possibility. But the fact of the matter is, generally speaking, we get the results that we pointed towards. And we wonder sometimes why it is that our children are selfish, and then we just take a step back and wonder, well, it's no wonder. Because it seems like all we do is cater to them. And every single thing they want, and every thought that they have, and every interest that they want, and they're just constantly giving, giving, giving. In Philippians chapter 2 and verse 3, notice with me the Apostle Paul says in verse 3, let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem others better than himself. Let each of you look out not only for his own interest, but also for the interests of others. Can I suggest to you tonight, friends, that children need to learn that concept as well? And if they're going to learn it, don't just trust the Bible class teachers. They'll do the best job they can. But it needs to be reinforced on a daily basis in our homes. Our children need to learn that they should not have selfish ambitions, that they should not be centered around themselves continually. They should not always have their mindset upon what it is they want, that they ought to be considerate of others and learn to be selfless. I'm convinced that we have a lot of selfish adults because they grew up being selfish and weren't given any instruction to the contrary. And it's become a great challenge. I'm not saying that on occasion that we don't do things for our children and that we don't occasionally make sacrifices. But friends, the fact of the matter is that if parents continually do that without any restraint whatsoever, we're going to end up in a mess. And we're going to have children who don't ever consider anything but themselves. You know, sometimes it may be easier. You're at a gathering of some sort. And sometimes what our mindset is, let's get the children through, right? So that they'll be out of sight, out of mind. And then we can do what we want to do. Which is kind of a selfish act in itself in some ways. But here's the problem that creates. When you do that on a constant basis, children are trained to believe what? That they're always first. And you say to yourself, when you see your child, or my child, I should say, include myself in that conversation, when we see them do some selfish act and we wonder how it is they got there, the truth of the matter is they got there because I led them there. Because throughout my life, I'm constantly saying, you go ahead, go ahead, go ahead, go ahead. Sometimes we need to say, you wait, you wait, you wait, you wait. So that they understand the concept that everything isn't about them. That everything does not center around them. Because if you think it's hard dealing with a child who has a selfish mentality, wait till they're an adult and see how hard it is to deal with when they're consumed with self. I did not say that they are never first. I said they cannot be always first. Or we're going to have a difficult time dealing with that. Children should learn the benefit of responsibility. In Lamentations chapter 3 and in verse 27, he just simply said a man ought to learn the idea of work in his youth. Now, I'm not saying take your 5-year-old down to the factory and sign him up. Okay? That's not what I'm saying. But a 5-year-old can clean their room. A 5-year-old can help you with the dishes. And you say, well, I don't want my child breaking my fine china. Then buy some cheap stuff so they can help you. Let them understand the idea of work. And I know, moms, you're busy. And I know, dads, you're busy. And it's just a lot easier to kick Billy on down the street and say, you go do something else. Dad's got to get this job done. But maybe take some time and let him have some responsibility. Let her have some responsibility. Let them learn the concept of work in their youth. That's what the Bible says. And maybe we'll have a better chance of not raising selfish children in the process. Because you raise a selfish child, then how are you going to convey that concept to them? You tell a child every day of their lives that they're first, they're first, they're first, and then you wonder when they leave the home and they have no interest in spiritual things. Well, you trained them to think they were number one, and when they go out into the world and are now making their own decisions and their own choices, they've been taught all their lives that they're the most important thing, so why are we shocked when God is of no interest to them? Why are we shocked when they have no interest in spiritual things, when we continually told them that they're the most important thing? We need to convey this concept, the idea that God is first, in Matthew chapter 10, verse 37. In Matthew chapter 10 and verse 37, Jesus, again speaking in this passage, simply says, he who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Here's the harder one. And he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Would you let that sink in for a minute? I love my children with all my heart. I would give myself for them any day. I would hope no harm whatsoever in their lives. But dear friend, the day I love them more than I love God is the day I ruin them. They may see me making sacrifices on their behalf. Friends, let me share with you something I believe is more important. Let your children see you making sacrifices on God's behalf. You want them to grow up to be children who are willing to make self-denial. They're willing to make sacrifices on behalf of the Lord's kingdom and for the cause of Christ. Then let them see you doing it. As they grow up in your home, let them see you sacrificing. Let them see parents who are not selfish, who aren't consumed with themselves and don't always think about their needs and their wants and their desires and put all of those things always before the Lord. Once again, friends, I'm afraid that we're raising children in that manner, and the end result of that, because they never saw me put God first. They never saw me prioritize Him. They never saw me put spiritual things over family things. You know, I know you live in Buckeye country. I am very, very cautious when I come to Columbus, how I speak about certain things. I said something over at West Broad years ago, and they didn't laugh, and I thought I was done. That was like Monday night. I'm meeting over. Go back to West Virginia, hillbilly. So I'm careful nowadays. I'm much more careful what I say. I grew up and live in a place where football was king. It may not be the best football in the world, but it's king. It rules in the fall. And all that people can think about and talk about is Friday night lights. And I love to walk, yes, walk to my little high school stadium 2 blocks away from my home. And I'd enjoy the festivities of that time of year. But friends, at some point in time, we've got to find some way to convey to our children, whether it's Friday nights, whether it's basketball, football, basket weaving, I don't care what it is, you throw it in there. I joked about Longaberger one time, thought I was done in that meeting too. Let's do something to begin to illustrate to our children on a daily basis that the Lord rules in this house. Not this guy. I don't rule in this house. The Lord rules in this house. God is first. God is first. And yes, even in the house of God, among God's people, selfishness has created great challenges and difficulties that men have had to overcome. In 3 John, the book of 3 John, verses 5 through 10, there's a man by the name of Diotrephes. And I want you to notice a couple of things about him and his selfish nature of his power and influence over the church where he assembled. In verse 5 of 3 John, beloved, you do faithfully whatever you do for the brethren and for strangers, who have borne witness of your love before the church. If you send them forward on their journey in a manner worthy of God, you will do well, because they went forth from His name's sake, taking nothing from the Gentiles. And we therefore ought to receive such, that we may become fellow workers with the truth. Basically, what John says to them initially is, you have been very selfless. You've been sacrificing, you've been loving, you've sent forth servants, you've become fellow workers in the truth. You've had great opportunities to show the kind of love that God would want you to demonstrate, but there's a problem. He says, I wrote to you though, in verse 9, but Diotrephes, who loves to have the preeminence. Use whatever translation you choose, but add this thought. Diotrephes, who is selfish. That's what having the preeminence is about. The idea of having the preeminence is I have to be what? I have to be first. That's the idea of selfishness, right? Diotrephes is selfish. He must have the rule. He must have the last say. His thoughts are better than everybody else's. And he's wrecking the church because of his selfish ambition. So much so that he says, but Diotrephes, who loves to have the preeminence among them, does not receive, notice, us. Now, can you imagine a man so selfish and so determined and so bent on his ways and his thoughts and his preeminence that he won't even receive the Apostle John? Is not even welcome there. Us, John says. Therefore, if I come, I will call to mind his deeds which he does, prating against us with malicious words, and not content with that, he himself does not receive the brethren, and forbids those who wish to, putting them out of the church. I don't know whether this is exactly germane to our conversation, but I want to say it because I think it fits in the context. In the importance of maintaining the purity of the church, at times we have been very cautious about who we consider ourselves in fellowship with and who we consider ourselves out of fellowship with. Who belongs to the Lord and who doesn't belong to the Lord. And let me suggest to you that on my general ideas over the years and what I've witnessed, that folks generally lean towards the side of making sure we keep the wrong people out. Folks that don't deserve to be part of the body of Christ. Those who are challenged in some way. And we're always concerned about making sure that we don't let the wrong person in. Somebody who's done something or said something. And so we've got this great cautious about us. But did you notice that John just said that it is just as important for us to be sure that we don't leave somebody out who God has received? Did you notice that John just said that Diotrephes was refusing people that the Lord had embraced? And friends, let me suggest to you that we can err on the other side of this problem as well. Yes, there may be times where we receive somebody who has some sinful behavior or something they have done that has not been rectified, and we'll make a mistake in relationship to that. But let me suggest to you that I'm concerned that we make just as big a mistake and we become very selfish and we say, well, I know about this circumstance and I know what the real truth is and I understand it better than anybody understands it, and he doesn't belong. Be careful. That was Diotrephes. He had all the right answers. He knew who belonged to the Lord and who didn't belong to the Lord, but John says, no, he doesn't. And when I get there, I'm going to call him to mind that he is refusing folks who are in fellowship with God. Brethren and friend, that's the only question I am convinced that we have to ask. When we're trying to determine whether somebody is in fellowship with us, the only question to ask is, are they in fellowship with God? And get our Bibles open and see what that means. And if somebody belongs to God, then they can belong to us. If somebody belongs to the Lord, then they can belong here at Laurel Canyon, or they can belong to us over in Payton City, or wherever you happen to find yourself. And selfishness among some brethren, and the idea that their superior knowledge is going to determine who is right and who is wrong and who gets in and who is out, has created many a conflict among churches. Selfishness is a major issue. But let's turn to anger for a minute. Well, let's not literally turn to anger, but let's turn to it in our discussion. In James chapter 1, James gives us some tremendously valuable insight when he makes a very simple statement. He says in verse 19, "So then, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath." Have you ever noticed sometimes how we do the exact opposite? Have you ever noticed how that we are quick to speak, quick to wrath, and slow to listen? We do the exact opposite of what James tells us to do here. You want to know how you and I can avoid a lot of angry moments? You want to know how it is that we might be able to avoid some of the challenges that we present to ourselves, whether it be in our families or among brethren? It's simply by adding the idea that I want to be slow to anger and wrath. It better rise to a righteous indignation before I get there. It ought to be something that is of a sinful nature. It ought to be something worthy of rising to a righteous indignation. You know, it's amazing how much anger you and I will avoid if we'll just stop and listen to what's actually going on. Have you ever gotten angry over something and you didn't really even understand what the conversation was about? Oh, now look at all you dishonest people looking at me like, that ain't never happened to me, preacher. We've all done, okay. I have, I'm willing. I heard 3 words. I know exactly what they're talking about, and I'm firing off. And I ignore what James said. My children come to me and they say 3 words, and I already have the answer because I'm smarter than them, because I'm their dad and that's what the Lord said, and I've got the answer for them before they even ask the question. And then we wonder why our children are quick to anger when they see me do that. I wish I never had to drive my children in a car with me. I wish I could just pull a trailer or something behind me so they could never see me. I had Rachel just 2 days, yesterday. That was yesterday. Isn't it amazing how awful we become? You get behind the wheel of a car and just, my wife wishes there just like an encasing bubble would just come down across the driver's seat. Just let me sit there by myself, right? Because the traffic's either always too slow or it's always too fast or they can't do this or nobody knows how to drive except for me. You ever shake your fist at somebody out on the road just because they happen to cut a little short? We shake our fist at them like they ripped our front bumper off. And all they did was come into our aura. We're quick to anger. And our children are watching. And I I thank the Lord regularly for Deborah sitting beside me in a car, to be quite honest with you, because all she does is she reaches over and she gives me a tap on the leg, like to say, Brian. Slow to anger, James says. Listen. Listen to what people are saying. Listen to your children. Listen to what they're saying. Young people, listen to your parents. Actually listen to what they're saying before you react. Process it. Brethren need to learn that too, by the way. One of the greatest pieces of wisdom I ever heard a preacher tell me one time was, I was just a conversation about why does it seem like divisiveness just seems to come so quickly nowadays? I mean, we have instantaneous divide. You say one thing. I fear the media world we live in, Jason. I'll be honest with you. There are times where I tell them back home, this isn't going to the internet. I'm talking to the church here in Payton City, and that's it. We need to have a conversation. Don't put this on the web. Now, the benefit of that is it don't go on the web back home unless I put it on the web. But there are times where we have to have a conversation without fear of that hitting the airwaves and brethren across the country misunderstanding the reason why you had that conversation. Because we have a very divisive spirit among brethren, it seems, someday. And that preacher said this. This was his assessment of why. He said 50 years ago, if there was an issue that arose, a man would ask a question, the preacher would go home and he'd think about it for a couple of days, and he'd put it away. 2 days later, he might get it back out and he'd think about it some more. He might think about that for 2 or 3 weeks, and then he would sit down and slowly pen his thoughts about the question that was asked. Then he'd put it away, and he'd wait a little while, and he'd read it again. And over a month or so, he would concisely determine what the right answer, that to the best of his ability, and would send that in response. Nowadays, we see a post and we go, enter. And then we wonder why people get upset and angry, because we don't even know what we're talking about, but we're posting about it. And we're reacting to it. And friends, let me suggest to you that there's a lot of anger, a lot of jealousy, a lot of selfishness, a lot of problems that occur. And a lot of love is missed because we hit the enter key way too quick. Slow. Listen. Watch our words. Proverb 15 verse 1 says to us, Proverb 15:1, he said, a soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. You know how I know that's true? Because I've stirred up some anger with harsh words. That's how I know that's true. I've gotten upset too quick. I've overreacted to something. I didn't think it through. Somebody said something and they're wrong. Boy, they don't even know the Bible at all, and I'm ready to tell them that. When a soft answer may have turned that wrath away, a softer answer, a softer response. Some may say as I get older that you're mellowing as a preacher. I hope so. I'll be honest with you, I hope so. I don't want to be that 20-year-old preacher all my life who's just real quick to give a snappy answer to everything. I tell young preachers sometimes, they get together with other preachers, and I say, listen to the ones that are 15 years older than you. If there's a preacher sitting in the same table and he's 15 years older than you, listen, let him speak. And if there's one 30 years older than you, let him talk before that guy speaks. Watch your words. Don't overreact, because the results can linger. A walled city, bars on a castle, because of anger and the challenges it presents. And here's where we're going to skip, because I want to get here. Let me share some things with you about to the unmarried. Whether you're a teenager, whether you're a young adult, or if you're however old, and might consider dating, have a right to date and to consider marriage. And let me share with you some thoughts this evening before we close. Can I suggest to you tonight that you take warning if the person you're dating has angry and selfish tendencies before marriage? I've seen many a spouse who thought that they would get married, then change them. I've seen many a married couple who just thought that all that it would take would be a ring. That's all it would take, is a ring will change them the moment they're married. The moment they say, I do, they'll quit being angry. They'll quit being selfish. My friends, that simply generally is not the case. If the boy or the girl you're dating has angry and selfish tendencies at the moment, a wedding ring tomorrow is probably not going to erase those selfish and anger tendencies, and you and I need to take warning about that. In Matthew chapter 21 and in verse 19, Jesus encounters an interesting tree. In Matthew chapter 21 and in verse 19, he said, "And seeing a fig tree by the road, he came to it and found nothing on it but leaves, and said to it, 'Let no fruit grow on you ever again.' And immediately the fig tree withered away." You say, "Preacher, what in the world has that got to do with what you're talking about?" Well, let me tell you what I believe it has to do. Young ladies and young men, there are a lot of young ladies and young men out there in the world that you might be looking at, and they're nothing but leaves. They have the superficial view of being something that was attractive to you. And I don't just mean physically, I mean for other reasons. And you look at and you determine in your mind there's something about it. They're a tree. But on closer inspection, you see that that tree is nothing but leaves. There's no fruit there. Friends, if you do not see spiritual fruit in their life prior to your marriage, then do not expect it to happen the day after you were married. I'm begging you, see the fruit first. I'm pleading with you. I can guarantee you that Jason and others have sat down many a time in an office somewhere, across the table or across the desk with folks who have been married. And one or the other of them knew there was no fruit of spiritualness in that person that they were marrying. They knew it when they got married. Assumed that that would be erased the moment they got married, and it didn't, and now they're struggling. I'm imploring you, young people or old people, whoever it is that might be dating at this time, look for the fruit, not the tree. Look for the evidence of spirituality. Look for the evidence of one who loves the Lord. And sometimes what we say is we just say things like, let them be a Christian. I don't know that that covers enough right now. That word is used so generically right now, I'm not so sure it gets the evidence across. I'm telling you, look for real fruit. Not just as their name on a roster somewhere, not just as their name in some kind of book somewhere that says they're a member of this church or that church. I'm asking you to examine the fruit before you say, "I do." Because, brother and friend, once you say, "I do," then that challenges everything that we can do to help in that circumstance. The time to run is before you say, "I do." The time to flee away from one who is not evidencing themselves to be the spiritual person they ought to be is before they say, "I do." Some people think I'm crazy, but you know that, well, a lot of people probably. But you know one of the things that I say to young couples before they walk up the aisle when I do their wedding? I say, "Last chance." And I say it with all seriousness. If you have any inclination, if you have any reservation, if you have any doubt in your mind whatsoever, and I'm not just talking about a little bit of cold feet, I'm talking about a real doubt of the quality of the person that you are about to join in marriage, then now's your chance to walk away. Because once you say, "I do" to them and before the Lord above, you have bound yourself in a relationship that the Lord says you may not put asunder. And so think wisely before you get there. You see, challenges come when we ignore it until after we're married. Challenges come when we ignore those things. And friends, you may be sitting here, and that may be you, and I'm not trying to hurt you in any way tonight. And I think that the people who know what I'm talking about, those who are struggling in their marriages because they're dealing with selfishness and anger with the spouse, I think they would want me to tell you this. If you're dating and you're seeing these tendencies, I think they would want you to know they would not want you to follow their steps. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 10, let me read it to you, and I'm going to simplify it in ways you could never believe. This passage has confounded and challenged folks, and I've seen it twisted and turned and wrested in all kinds of ways. But 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 10, "Now to the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, a wife is not to depart from her husband, but even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband, and a husband is not to divorce his wife. But to the rest, I, not the Lord, say, if any brother has a wife who does not believe, and she is willing to live with him, let him not divorce her. And a woman who has a husband who does not believe, if he is willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but now they are holy. But if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. Here's my simplified thought. What a mess. What a mess that we create and the Lord has to spin us out of. What a mess that we create because we don't think before we say I do. Because we don't think before we make the choice and decision to put ourselves into a marriage relationship, and we don't look for the fruit. And then we've got this whole question of, are they an unbeliever? Did they depart? Are they going to stay? Am I going to be reconciled? Or what are we going to do? And all of that because we didn't look for the fruit first. Friends, gestures of I love you, by the way, does not give anyone the right to be abusive either. I don't care how many flowers he's bringing you. Young people, listen to me. I don't care how many gifts he bestows. I don't care how nice he seems most of the time. If he is abusive in any way, I'm begging you before you say I do, run as far as you can run. Because selfish and anger demonstrated in these ways is too painful. In Acts, the 8th chapter, Saul begins to persecute the Lord's church and creating great challenges to it. Folks begin to scatter and take the great word of Jesus with them. That's one of the most interesting aspects of what Saul did, was his attempt to try to stop the progression of the Lord's church and the preaching of Jesus was actually the greatest catalyst the world had ever seen. To taking that message out of Jerusalem and sending it everywhere that those folks had come from. In Acts the 8th chapter, a eunuch had been introduced to the thoughts of Jesus by Philip. And the text says that it says to us is that Philip preached unto him Jesus, and Philip and the eunuch arrived at a body of water, and the eunuch says, see, here is water, what that hindereth me to be baptized? Philip says, if thou believest, thou mayest. Two men go down into the water, and the eunuch is immersed to salvation. And he goes on his way rejoicing. There will be great rejoicing in this room and in heaven of one soul who would come to Jesus tonight. For one soul who would make a decision to serve the Lord. For one soul who would determine tonight to restore themselves back to the Savior. So if we can encourage you tonight to think soberly about your relationship with Christ, ask yourself the question, if the Lord were to return, if the Lord would come back this very hour, and who are we to say that He won't? Am I ready to meet Him? Would I be excited to meet Him? Not just preparing, but longing for, hoping for. Haste make the day that our Lord comes and we can share eternity with Him. And so if you're out of Christ and need to know remission of sins and need to know what it's like to be in Christ through baptism, when we can encourage you in that tonight, or if there's something amiss, something that we could pray for you concerning, we invite you to consider your salvation even this hour. And if we can help you, won't you come while we stand and while we sing?